A 13-year-old boy who never knew his parents finds his grandfather collapsed in the forest. When the rescue team sees what he did to save him, they can't hold back their tears. Anthony Thompson's sneakers crunched against the fallen pine needles as he followed his grandfather deeper into Mount Hood National Forest. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, creating patches of light on the dirt path ahead. His worn backpack, stuffed with a half-empty water bottle and some trail mix, bounced against his back with each step. "Keep up, son," Mr. Thompson called over his shoulder, his voice carrying the weight of his 70 years. "The best spots are just ahead." Anthony quickened his pace, his eyes fixed on his grandfather's familiar green Ranger jacket. The jacket had seen better days, its patches faded and edges frayed, but Mr. Thompson wore it on every walk they took together. It was his badge of honor from 30 years of service in these woods. "Grandpa, slow down a bit," Anthony said, noticing how his grandfather's breathing seemed heavier than usual. "We've got all afternoon." Mr. Thompson waved him off with a weathered hand. "Just catching my breath. These hills aren't as friendly as they used to be." He stopped at a fallen log, lowering himself with a slight grimace. "Come here, let me show you something." Anthony sat beside him, the rough bark pressing through his jeans. His grandfather pulled out his old leather-bound notebook, its pages yellow with age and crisp with use. "See these markings?" Mr. Thompson pointed to a series of scratches on a nearby tree trunk. "That's how the bears mark their territory. Always good to know where you're not welcome." Anthony leaned forward, studying the deep gouges in the bark. "Like the ones we saw last month? Good memory?" Mr. Thompson smiled, pride evident in his dark eyes. "You're learning fast. Faster than your father ever did." The mention of his father made Anthony's stomach tighten. He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, avoiding his grandfather's gaze. "I got called to the office again today," Anthony said quietly. "They want to have another parent-teacher conference." Mr. Thompson's smile faded. "What happened this time?" "Mrs. Peterson says I'm not focusing in class." Anthony kicked at a pine cone. "She caught me drawing the forest again, instead of doing math problems. The forest will always be here," Mr. Thompson said, his voice firm but gentle. "Education comes first. Your grandmother and I dash." He stopped mid-sentence, pressing a hand against his chest. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool morning air. "Grandpa?" Anthony straightened, alarm creeping into his voice. "Are you okay? Just need a minute." Mr. Thompson's words came out strained. He fumbled with the zipper of his jacket, his hands shaking. "Maybe we should head back." Anthony stood, reaching for his grandfather's arm. "We can turn around. I'll help you dash." The sentence died in his throat as Mr. Thompson slumped forward, his notebook sliding from his lap and scattering loose pages across the forest floor. His eyes rolled back, and before Anthony could react, his grandfather's body pitched sideways off the log. "Grandpa!" Anthony lunged forward, barely managing to break his grandfather's fall. The old man's weight dragged them both to the ground. "Grandpa, wake up!" Mr. Thompson lay motionless on the bed of pine needles, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. His skin felt clammy under Anthony's trembling fingers. "Help!" Anthony screamed, his voice echoing through the trees. "Somebody help us!" Only the whisper of wind through the branches answered him. Anthony fumbled for his phone, his heart pounding against his ribs. The screen lit up, but where the signal bar should have been, there was only an empty space, and the words "no service" stared back at him. "No, no, no!" He scrambled to his feet, holding the phone higher, turning in circles. "Please, just one bar." His grandfather's labored breathing filled the silence. Anthony dropped back to his knees, his hands hovering helplessly over Mr. Thompson's still form. "Grandpa, please wake up." His voice cracked. "I don't know what to do. Please." Dark clouds began gathering overhead, turning the forest shadows deeper and more menacing. A cool wind picked up, carrying the promise of rain. Anthony looked up at the darkening sky, then back at his unconscious grandfather, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He was alone in the woods with his dying grandfather, no phone signal, and a storm approaching. Every lesson his grandfather had taught him about the forest seemed to evaporate from his mind, leaving only raw, primal fear in its place. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall through the canopy. Anthony pulled off his jacket, draping it over his grandfather's chest. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he tried to remember the basic first aid his grandfather had taught him. Check breathing, check pulse, he muttered to himself, pressing his fingers against Mr. Thompson's neck like he'd been shown. The heartbeat he felt was rapid and irregular. "Stay with me, Grandpa. Please stay with me." The rain fell harder now, soaking through his t-shirt. Anthony looked back the way they had come, trying to remember how long they'd been walking. An hour? Maybe more? The trail seemed to disappear into a green maze of shadows and rain. A decision crystallized in his mind. He had to get help, but that meant leaving his grandfather alone in the strengthening storm. The thought made his chest ache with fear and uncertainty. Thunder cracked overhead closer this time, making Anthony jump. He looked down at his grandfather's pale face, watching a raindrop roll down the weathered cheek. "I'll be back," he whispered, squeezing Mr. Thompson's hand. "I promise I'll bring help. Just hold on." Standing up, Anthony shrugged off his backpack and placed it under his grandfather's head as a makeshift pillow. He took one last look at the still form on the ground, trying to memorize exactly where they were: the distinctive bent tree, the fallen log, the rock formation just visible through the rain. Then he turned and ran down the trail, his feet slipping on the wet pine needles, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the storm gathered strength, and somewhere in the growing darkness, his grandfather lay fighting for his life. The forest that had always felt like home now seemed to close in around him like a trap. And for the first time in his life, Anthony Thompson felt truly, devastatingly alone. Anthony's feet pounded against the muddy trail as rain pelted his face. His soaked t-shirt clung to his skin, and his chest burned with each desperate breath. He'd been running for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. "Help!" he screamed again, his voice breaking. "Anyone, please!" The storm swallowed his cries. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the forest in stark white for a split second. The thunder that followed was so loud it made his teeth rattle. Anthony stopped, doubling over with his hands on his knees. His legs trembled from exhaustion. Water dripped from his nose as he tried to get his breathing under control. "Think," he gasped. "Think like Grandpa taught you." He straightened up, forcing himself to take in his surroundings. The rain had turned the trail into a muddy stream. Fallen branches littered the ground, torn loose by the wind. The familiar markers he usually used to navigate, distinctive trees, rock formations, trail signs, all looked different in the storm. His phone was still clutched in his right hand, screen dark and useless. He pressed the power button, squinting against the rain at the display. Still no signal, and now the battery was at 47%. "Okay," he said out loud, his voice shaking. "Okay, what would Grandpa do?" The memory of his grandfather's lessons floated back to him. If you're lost, stop moving. Find shelter. Wait for help. But he couldn't stop. Not with his grandfather lying unconscious in the rain. A crack of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by deafening thunder. Anthony jumped, his foot slipping on the muddy ground. He fell hard, landing on his side in a puddle. Pain shot through his hip and elbow. "Get up," he muttered, pushing himself to his knees. "Get up!" His hands were covered in mud now, and his right elbow stung where he'd scraped it. He wiped his face with his sleeve, but it just smeared more mud across his cheek. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. Branches creaked and swayed overhead. Anthony knew he should find shelter. The storm was getting dangerous. But every minute he wasted was a minute his grandfather spent alone, getting colder and weaker. He forced himself back to his feet, wincing at the pain in his hip. Looking around, he tried to spot anything familiar, any sign of civilization. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a wall of gray-green shadows in the rain. "Which way?" he whispered. "Which way did we come from?" His eyes landed on a fallen tree ahead. Something about it looked familiar. Hadn't they passed it earlier? The bark pattern, the way it leaned. Anthony limped toward it, hope fluttering in his chest. Yes, this was definitely familiar. They'd stopped here, so his grandfather could point out some mushrooms growing on the trunk. If I can find this, he said to himself, I can find other landmarks. He pressed on, scanning the forest for more familiar signs. The rain had slowed slightly, but the wind still whipped through the trees, sending leaves and small branches flying. His teeth chattered from cold and fear. After 10 minutes of careful walking, Anthony froze. The trail split ahead of him, one path leading uphill, the other curving down into a valley. He didn't remember this fork. No, he whispered. No, no, no. He spun in a circle, panic rising in his throat. Nothing looked right anymore. The fallen tree he'd recognized. Had it really been the same one? Or had he just convinced himself it was familiar because he desperately wanted it to be? Think, he shouted, slamming his fist against a nearby tree trunk. Pain shot through his hand, but he barely noticed. Which way did we come from? The forest remained silent except for the storm. Anthony slumped against the tree, sliding down until he sat in the mud. His whole body shook with cold and exhaustion. I'm sorry, Grandpa, he whispered. I'm so sorry. He pulled his knees to his chest, trying to make himself smaller against the wind. What would happen to his grandfather if he couldn't find help? What would happen to Anthony himself if he couldn't find his way back? The image of his grandmother's face flashed through his mind. How worried she must be already. They should have been home hours ago. Would she send someone looking for them? Would anyone even know where to start searching? Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Anthony saw something through the trees, a glint of metal. He scrambled to his feet, squinting through the rain. There it was again, something man-made, reflecting what little light penetrated the storm clouds. Hope surged through him. Civilization meant people. People meant help. Anthony started running again, ignoring the pain in his hip and the burning in his lungs. He crashed through underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, keeping his eyes fixed on that distant metallic gleam. The trees thinned out, and suddenly he burst into a small clearing. In the center stood a ranger station, a small cabin with metal roof panels that had caught the light. The windows were dark, but a radio antenna rose from the roof like a beacon of hope. Hello, Anthony called, stumbling toward the cabin. Is anyone there? Please, I need help. He reached the door, his muddy hands slipping on the handle as he tried to turn it. Locked. Please. He pounded on the door with both fists. My grandfather's dying. Someone help us. No answer came from inside. Anthony pressed his face against a window, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the glare. The interior was dark and still. No movement, no signs of life. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees on the cabin's small porch. The relative shelter from the rain only emphasized how cold and wet he was. His clothes were completely soaked, mud-stained, and torn in places from his run through the forest. The cabin was abandoned, or maybe just empty for the day. Either way, it couldn't help him. Anthony hugged himself, rocking slightly as he tried to think. He could stay here, wait for rangers to return. But how long would that take? Hours? Days? His grandfather didn't have that kind of time. He could try to break in. Surely there would be a radio inside, or at least a first aid kit. But what if he damaged something important? What if he got in trouble? His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. The law is the law, son. No exceptions. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind him. Anthony spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Hello, he called out. Is someone there? Another crack, closer this time. Something was moving in the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing. Anthony stood slowly, his muscles tensing. His grandfather had taught him about the animals in these woods, bears, cougars, wolves. Any of them could be hunting in this weather. The brush rustled, and Anthony backed up against the cabin door. His fingers scratched against the rough wood as he searched blindly for anything he could use as a weapon. A shape emerged from the shadows of the trees. Anthony's breath caught in his throat as he made out the distinctive outline of a person wearing a rain poncho. Hey, he shouted, waving his arms, over here. Please, I need help. The figure turned toward his voice. For a moment, Anthony's heart soared with relief. Then lightning flashed again, illuminating the clearing in harsh white light. The poncho wasn't a poncho at all. It was a torn tarp, draped over the shoulders of a man whose wild eyes and matted beard marked him as anything but a rescue worker. The stranger took a step toward the cabin, toward Anthony. "Nice place they got here," the man said, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "You work for the Park Service, kid?" Anthony's mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. "My grandfather," he managed to say. "He needs help. He's hurt." The man took another step closer. Rain dripped from his tangled beard. "That right? And where might your grandfather be?" Anthony's back pressed harder against the cabin door. The man's eyes darted between Anthony and the cabin windows, calculating something Anthony didn't want to understand. "I should go," Anthony whispered. "I need to find help." "I'll help you, kid." The man's cracked lips spread in what might have been meant as a smile. "Why don't you just tell me where your grandfather is, and we'll go check on him together?" Anthony's body moved before his mind could process the decision. He ducked under the man's reaching arm and ran, not back the way he'd come, but deeper into the unknown forest, away from both the stranger and his grandfather. Behind him, he heard the man shout something, but the words were lost in a roll of thunder. Anthony ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at his face, his feet slipping in the mud. He ran until his lungs felt like they would burst, until the cabin and the stranger were far behind him. Only then did he slow to a stop, collapsing against a tree trunk. What had he done? He'd run in the wrong direction, away from his grandfather. The realization hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Tears mixed with rain on his face as he slid down to sit in the mud. He was lost, cold, and now even further from helping his grandfather than when he'd started. The storm raged on overhead, and somewhere in these vast woods, time was running out for the only father figure he'd ever known. Anthony's legs shook as he pushed himself up from the mud. His whole body ached, and his wet clothes felt like they weighed 100 pounds. He had to get back to his grandfather. But which way was that now? "Think," he muttered, wiping rain from his eyes. What did Grandpa say about getting unlost? The lesson came back to him in fragments. Find high ground. Look for landmarks. Follow water downhill to civilization. He turned in a slow circle, searching for anything that might help orient him. The storm had transformed the forest into an alien landscape of shifting shadows and creaking branches. Even the rain seemed to fall sideways now, driven by the relentless wind. "The cabin," he said out loud. "If I can find a cabin again, I can backtrack from there." But the thought of running into that stranger again made his stomach turn. What if the man was still there, waiting? What if he was following Anthony even now? A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Anthony spun around, his heart racing, but saw only trees swaying in the wind. Still, the sound spurred him into motion. He picked a direction that seemed to slope upward and started walking. His shoes squelched with every step, and his wet socks rubbed painfully against his feet. He was pretty sure he had blisters forming, but he couldn't stop to check. The sky was getting darker, whether from the storm or approaching evening. He couldn't tell anymore. After 15 minutes of uphill climbing, Anthony reached a small ridge. He stopped, breathing hard, and tried to get his bearings. From this height, he could see further through the forest, but the view only confirmed how hopelessly lost he was. Trees stretched in every direction, their tops whipping back and forth in the wind. "Come on," he whispered, scanning the landscape desperately. "Show me something. Anything." Lightning flashed, and for a split second, Anthony thought he saw something in the distance, a different kind of shadow against the stormy sky. When the light faded, he strained his eyes, trying to find it again. Another flash revealed what he'd seen, a fire tower, rising above the treetops maybe a mile away. His grandfather had pointed it out on previous hikes. It was one of several towers rangers used to spot forest fires. Yes! Anthony pumped his fist in the air. This was something he could use. The tower would have a radio, maps, emergency supplies. Even if it was unmanned, it would be better than wandering blind through the forest. He started down the ridge in the tower's direction, moving as fast as he dared on the slippery ground. His renewed hope gave him energy, pushing back the exhaustion that had been threatening to overwhelm him. The trail, if it could be called that, descended steeply into a ravine. Anthony had to grab onto tree trunks and branches to keep from sliding all the way down. Halfway down, his foot caught on an exposed root, and he pitched forward. He tumbled head over heels down the slope, unable to stop himself. Rocks and branches battered his body until he finally rolled to a stop at the bottom, face down in a shallow stream. Anthony pushed himself up, spitting out muddy water. Everything hurt. He looked down at himself. His clothes were even more torn now, and a long scratch ran down his left arm, bleeding slightly. "Get up," he told himself through chattering teeth. "Get up." Using a nearby tree for support, he dragged himself to his feet. The world spun for a moment, but he forced himself to stay upright. He couldn't afford to rest. Not now. He checked his phone again, 31% battery now, and still no signal. The screen was cracked from his fall, but it still worked. He tried to wipe it dry with his shirt, but his clothes were too soaked to help. Looking up through the trees, he tried to spot the fire tower again, but the foliage was too dense from down here. He'd have to trust his sense of direction and keep moving. The stream gurgled beside him, swollen with rainwater. Anthony remembered another of his grandfather's lessons. Water always flows downhill, and people build near water. Follow a stream, and you'll find civilization. But the fire tower wasn't downhill. It was up on a ridge, probably the highest point around. Which should he follow? The water or his original plan? Thunder rumbled overhead, closer than ever. Anthony jumped at the sound, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He had to make a decision. The tower. It was his best chance of finding help quickly. He could follow streams later if this didn't work. Anthony started climbing the opposite side of the ravine, using roots and small trees to pull himself up. The slope was just as steep as the one he'd fallen down, but this time he moved more carefully, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it. His muscles screamed in protest. He'd never been the most athletic kid in school, preferring books and drawing to sports. Now he wished he'd spent more time in gym class instead of daydreaming about the forest. Halfway up the slope, he had to stop. His arms trembled with exhaustion, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He pressed his forehead against the wet earth, trying to catch his breath. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do this." The image of his grandfather lying unconscious in the rain filled his mind. How long had it been now? An hour? 2? Every minute he wasted meant less chance of finding help in time. "Get up," he screamed at himself, slamming his fist into the ground. "Get up!" Birds scattered from nearby trees at his outburst. Anthony grabbed the nearest root and pulled himself up another few feet. Then another, and another. When he finally reached the top of the ravine, he collapsed onto relatively flat ground, his chest heaving. Rain continued to pour down, but he barely noticed it anymore. He was beyond wet, beyond cold, beyond tired. He lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring up at the dark sky through the canopy. What if he was going the wrong way? What if the tower was farther than he thought? What if his grandfather was already? No. He cut off that thought before it could finish. He's alive. He has to be alive. Anthony rolled onto his side and pushed himself to his knees. His clothes were caked with mud, and he could feel scratches and bruises all over his body. But none of that mattered. Only one thing mattered: finding help. He stood up on shaky legs and looked around. The forest seemed different on this side of the ravine. The trees were older, taller, with less underbrush between them. That meant this area probably hadn't burned recently, which meant it was closer to active ranger patrol areas. A fresh surge of hope gave him strength. He started walking again, trying to maintain what he thought was the direction to the tower. His grandfather had taught him to walk in straight lines by lining up landmarks ahead of him, but in this weather, he could barely see 20 feet ahead. The wind picked up again, and Anthony hugged himself for warmth. His teeth chattered so hard he worried they might break. How long could someone survive in weather like this? How long could his grandfather last? A sound cut through the storm, distant but distinct. A mechanical whirring, like a helicopter? Anthony's heart leaped. Yes, that was definitely a helicopter. They were looking for him. He ran toward the sound, stumbling over logs and crashing through bushes. The noise grew louder. and through gaps in the canopy, he caught glimpses of rotating blades. "Here!" he screamed, waving his arms as he ran. "I'm here! Help!" The helicopter seemed to hover for a moment, its searchlight beam visible even through the rain and trees. Then it turned and moved away, the sound of its engines fading. "No!" Anthony chased after it, branches whipping at his face. "Come back! Please come back!" He burst into a small clearing and stopped dead. The fire tower rose before him, its metal frame stretching up into the stormy sky. But something was wrong. The top platform was partially collapsed, its walls torn away by some past storm. What he thought was a working fire tower was just a rusted skeleton. The helicopter sound faded completely, leaving only the wind and rain. Anthony stared up at the ruined tower, his last hope crumbling like the structure itself. His legs gave out, and he fell to his knees in the mud. Tears mixed with rain on his face as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He was lost, really, truly lost, and he'd failed the person who needed him most. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his words swallowed by the storm. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I'm sorry." The wind howled through the tower's metal frame, creating an eerie whistling sound. Anthony huddled on the ground, shivering uncontrollably. He'd never felt so small, so helpless, so utterly alone. But he couldn't stay here. His grandfather was counting on him. Even if this tower was useless, he had to keep trying, had to keep moving. With tremendous effort, Anthony pushed himself back to his feet. His body felt like it was made of lead, and his mind was foggy with exhaustion. But somewhere in these vast woods, his grandfather was dying, and Anthony Thompson was not going to give up. He looked up at the ruined tower one last time, trying to use it to orient himself. Then he turned and started walking again, into the deepening gloom of the forest, searching for any sign of help in this endless green maze. The storm raged on, and somewhere above, a rescue helicopter continued its search pattern, its crew unaware of the desperate boy trying to flag them down through the dense canopy below. The abandoned fire tower disappeared behind Anthony as he pushed forward through the forest. His legs moved mechanically now, one foot in front of the other, driven by pure stubbornness rather than strength. The storm had reached its peak, turning the afternoon as dark as evening. Something warm trickled down his face, blood from a scratch he didn't remember getting, mixing with the rain. He wiped it away with his sleeve, leaving another streak of mud across his cheek. His phone was dead now. The cracked screen had flickered one last time before going black, taking with it any chance of checking the time. How long had he been wandering? How long since he'd left his grandfather? A gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Anthony grabbed a tree trunk to steady himself, his fingers digging into the wet bark. The helicopter sound had completely vanished, swallowed by the storm. Had it really been there at all, or had his desperate mind imagined it? "Keep moving," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Just keep moving." His foot caught on something, a root or fallen branch, and he stumbled. This time when he tried to catch himself, his arms were too weak to respond. He hit the ground hard, face first in a puddle. Water filled his nose and mouth. Anthony thrashed, pushing himself up on trembling arms, coughing and spitting. The taste of mud and rotting leaves made him gag. "Get up," he wheezed. "Get up." But his body wouldn't respond. His muscles had finally reached their limit. He slumped back into the puddle, too exhausted to even lift his head. Maybe if he just rested for a minute, just closed his eyes for a moment. A crack of thunder jolted him awake. How long had he been lying there? Seconds? Minutes? The cold had seeped deep into his bones, making every movement agony. "Can't sleep," he slurred, forcing himself to his knees. "Can't stop." Something moved in the corner of his vision. Anthony's head snapped up, suddenly alert. Through the rain and gathering darkness, he saw a shape moving between the trees. Too big to be a person, too deliberate to be a shadow. Bear. The word floated up from his grandfather's lessons. Black bears hunted in weather like this, when their prey was distracted by the storm. Anthony's heart hammered against his ribs. What were you supposed to do with bears? Make yourself big? Play dead? His exhausted mind couldn't remember. The shape moved closer. Anthony stayed absolutely still, afraid even to breathe. A branch snapped under heavy weight. Then the wind shifted, and Anthony caught a whiff of something that definitely wasn't bear. Cigarette smoke. Hey, a gruff voice called out. Someone there? Anthony's first instinct was to run. After the stranger at the cabin, anyone could be dangerous, but his legs wouldn't move, and besides, what choice did he have anymore? Help! He tried to shout, but it came out as barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. Help! Over here! Flashlight beams cut through the rain, sweeping back and forth until they found him. Anthony squinted against the sudden brightness, raising a hand to shield his eyes. Jesus Christ, someone said, "It's a kid." Boots splashed through puddles. Through the glare of the flashlights, Anthony made out 3 figures in dark green uniforms, forest rangers. Real ones this time. "Are you Anthony Thompson?" One of them asked, kneeling beside him. "Your grandmother reported you and your grandfather missing." Anthony grabbed the ranger's sleeve with muddy fingers. "My grandpa," he gasped. "He's hurt. He collapsed. You have to help him." "Slow down, son." The ranger, his name tag read Martinez, tried to drape a blanket around Anthony's shoulders. "Are you hurt? How long have you been out here?" "No time." Anthony shoved the blanket away. "Please, my grandpa's dying. He needs help now." "Peters, radio base," Martinez ordered over his shoulder. "Tell them we found the boy." He turned back to Anthony. "Can you tell us where your grandfather is?" Anthony opened his mouth to answer, then froze. He looked around wildly, but nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every rock, every shadow looked the same in the storm. His voice cracked. "I don't know. I got lost. There was a cabin, and then a ravine, and the tower." "What tower?" Another ranger stepped forward, a woman with gray streaks in her hair. "The old fire tower?" "Yes." Anthony pointed in what he thought was the right direction. "I just came from there. My grandpa. He's somewhere between there and the main trail. I tried to get help, but there was no signal, and then this man at the cabin." "What man?" Martinez's voice sharpened. "What cabin?" "The ranger station," Anthony said. "The small one. There was a man there with a tarp." The rangers exchanged looks. "McMullen's old post," the woman said. "Been abandoned for years. Supposed to be locked up." "Search area's too big," the third ranger, Peters, said. "We need air support, dogs, something." "No time." Anthony tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Martinez caught him before he hit the ground. "Please, he's been out there for hours. The rain, the cold." "Easy, son." Martinez's voice was gentle but firm. "You can barely walk. Let us handle this." "But I can find him." Anthony struggled in the ranger's grip. "I made markers, left signs. If I could just—" His voice trailed off as something caught his eye. A familiar shape on a nearby tree. 3 parallel scratches in the bark. "Bear marks," he whispered. Then louder. "Bear marks. I saw these before, with Grandpa. He showed them to me right before." He twisted out of Martinez's grasp and stumbled to the tree, running his fingers over the gouges in the bark. "These are fresh. Grandpa was teaching me about them. He has to be close." The rangers converged on the tree, their flashlights illuminating the marks. "He's right," the woman said. "These are recent." "Peters, get search and rescue on the line," Martinez ordered. "Tell them to concentrate on this sector." He turned to Anthony. "What else do you remember? Anything distinctive about where you left him?" Anthony closed his eyes, forcing his exhausted mind to focus. "A fallen log," he said. "Big one. He was sitting on it when he collapsed. In a rock formation, kind of shaped like a crown." "Crown Rock," the woman said. "About half a mile north of here. That would put them right off the main trail." "That's it." Anthony's eyes snapped open. "That's where he is. I remember now." Martinez caught his arm as he tried to run off into the darkness. "Hold on, son. You've done enough. Let us take it from here." "No." Anthony yanked his arm free. "I left him. I have to be the one to find him." "Anthony," the woman ranger stepped forward, her face stern but kind. "Listen to me. Your grandfather needs immediate medical attention. We have a team with equipment standing by. The best way you can help him now is to let us do our job." "But—" Anthony's voice broke. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, leaving him shaking and weak. I promised I'd come back. And you did, Martinez said softly. You found help. You gave us the information we needed. You did everything right. The fight drained out of Anthony all at once. His legs gave out, and this time he didn't try to stop himself from crumpling to the ground. The Rangers caught him, lowering him gently. Peters, stay with him, Martinez ordered, shrugging off his rain jacket and wrapping it around Anthony's shoulders. Radio for medevac. He's showing signs of hypothermia. Susan and I will find a grandfather. No! Anthony tried to protest, but his voice was barely a whisper now. Please. It's okay, son. Peters knelt beside him, holding the jacket tight around his trembling body. You did good. Rest now. We'll take care of everything. Anthony watched through blurring vision as Martinez and the woman ranger disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness, their flashlight beams bouncing between the trees. He wanted to follow them, needed to be there when they found his grandfather. But his body had finally reached its absolute limit. Grandpa, he mumbled as unconsciousness crept in around the edges of his vision. I'm sorry. Hey, stay with me, kid. Peter's voice seemed to come from very far away. Anthony? Anthony. But Anthony couldn't respond. The world tilted sideways, and then everything went dark. He dreamed of running through an endless forest, chasing flashlight beams that always stayed just out of reach. His grandfather's voice called to him from every direction, but he could never find the source. The trees whispered his name, over and over. Anthony, Anthony, Anthony. His eyes snapped open. He was lying on something soft, a stretcher, inside what looked like a tent. Rain drummed against the canvas above him. Someone had wrapped him in thermal blankets, and in 4-line ran from his arm to a bag of clear fluid. Peter's face appeared above him. There you are. Had us worried for a minute. My grandpa, Anthony croaked. His throat felt like sandpaper. Did they? Before he could finish the question, his radio crackled. Peters, come in? Go ahead. Peters responded, pressing the talk button. We found him. Martinez's voice crackled through the static. Still breathing. Medics are working on him now. Tell the kid. Tell him his grandfather's going to be okay. Anthony's vision blurred with tears. The weight that had been crushing his chest since his grandfather collapsed finally lifted, leaving him lightheaded with relief. You hear that? Peters squeezed his shoulder. You did it, kid. You saved his life. But Anthony was already slipping back into unconsciousness, this time into a peaceful sleep free of running and searching. His last thought before darkness took him was of his grandfather's voice, teaching him about bear marks and survival and never giving up. The storm raged on outside the tent, but inside, wrapped in warm blankets with the knowledge that help had finally arrived, Anthony Thompson rested. He had done what seemed impossible. He had found his way through the darkness. He had saved his grandfather. Anthony jolted awake to the sound of urgent voices and radio static. The tent around him glowed with harsh portable lights, casting strange shadows on the canvas walls. His whole body ached, and his mind felt fuzzy, like he was thinking through cotton. BP's still low, someone was saying. We need to get him to the hospital. Can't fly in this weather. Another voice closer. Storm's too strong. Anthony tried to sit up, but his arms shook too badly to support his weight. The 4-line pulled at his skin. Easy there? Peters appeared beside him, putting a hand on his shoulder. You need to stay still. But my grandpa. Anthony's voice came out as a rasp. They're bringing him here, Peters said. Medical team's with him. Just hang on. The tent flap whipped open, letting in a blast of cold air and rain. 2 paramedics rushed in, carrying equipment bags. How's the kid? One of them asked, kneeling beside Anthony's stretcher. Conscious but weak, Peters reported. Temperature's coming up slowly. The paramedic, his name tag read Wilson, pulled out a pen light and shined it in Anthony's eyes. Pupils reactive. Can you tell me your full name? Anthony Thompson, he managed to say. Where's my grandpa? Coming right behind us. Can you squeeze my hand? Wilson held out his hand. Anthony tried, but his fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. The paramedic frowned slightly. Significant muscle fatigue, he noted. Probable mild hypothermia. How long was he out there? Not sure, Peters said. At least 4 hours in the storm. More voices outside. The tent flap opened again, and this time Martinez backed in, helping carry another stretcher. Anthony caught a glimpse of his grandfather's face, pale and still, before the medical team surrounded him. "Grandpa!" Anthony tried again to sit up. This time he managed to raise himself on his elbows before someone pushed him back down. "Stay still," Wilson ordered. "You're not helping him by hurting yourself." Anthony subsided, but his eyes stayed fixed on the cluster of people around his grandfather's stretcher. Medical terms flew back and forth. Words like arrhythmia and cardiac episode that made his stomach twist with fear. "Is he?" Anthony's voice cracked. "Is he going to?" "They're doing everything they can," Peters said quietly. "But we need to focus on you right now. You're not out of the woods yet yourself." A bitter laugh escaped Anthony's throat. "Not out of the woods," he repeated. "That's funny." Peters smiled slightly. "Poor choice of words. Sorry." The tent flap opened yet again. The female ranger from before, Anthony still didn't know her name, stepped in, shaking water from her jacket. "Road's blocked," she reported. "Landslide about 2 miles down. Crews are working on it, but—" "How long?" Martinez asked. 3 hours minimum. Maybe more." The medical team exchanged looks. "He may not have 3 hours," one of them said quietly, nodding toward Anthony's grandfather. Anthony's heart seemed to stop. "No," he whispered. "No, please. We found help. We did everything right. He can't." "Does anyone copy?" A crackling voice came through the Rangers' radios. "This is Air Rescue 1. Weather's clearing slightly at higher altitudes. We might have a window." Martinez snatched up his radio. "Air Rescue 1, this is ground team. We need immediate evac. 2 patients, 1 critical." Static filled the tent. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. "Ground team, we can attempt pickup, but we'll need a clear landing zone." "Over." "Nearest LZ is 3 miles out," the female ranger said. "Too far for the critical patient." Anthony's mind raced. Through the fog of exhaustion and fear, something clicked. "The tower," he said. "What?" Several heads turned toward him. "The old fire tower," Anthony said, stronger now. "The clearing there? It's big enough. And it's close." "Too dangerous," Martinez said immediately. "That tower's been condemned for years. Ground's probably unstable, but it's our only chance." Anthony pushed himself up again, ignoring the dizziness that washed over him. "Please, you have to try." The medical team huddled together, speaking in low voices. Anthony caught fragments. Significant risk and best chance and running out of time. Finally, one of them turned to Martinez. "The boy's right. It's our best option." Martinez ran a hand through his hair, thinking. The radio crackled again. "Ground team, windows closing. What's your status?" "Oh, do it," Anthony begged. "Please. I can show you the way. I was just there." "You're not going anywhere," Wilson said firmly. "You can barely sit up, but I remember the path. I can describe it." Anthony looked from face to face, desperate for someone to listen. "Please. He's all I have." Martinez studied him for a long moment. Then he raised the radio to his mouth. "Air Rescue 1, we have a possible LZ. Stand by for coordinates." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of activity. Rangers and paramedics moved back and forth, preparing equipment, checking maps, relaying coordinates. Anthony described every detail he could remember about the path to the tower. The steep ravine, the old-growth trees, the distinctive landmarks. His grandfather remained unconscious through it all, his breathing shallow and irregular. The medical team worked continuously, checking vital signs, adjusting medications. "BP's dropping," someone reported. "We need to move now." "Storm's picking up again," the female ranger warned, coming in from outside. Windows closing fast. Martinez made the call. "Move out." "Susan, you're with me on point." "Peters, bring up the rear." Medical team in the middle with the patients. "I can walk," Anthony protested as they started to transfer him to a portable stretcher. "Not a chance," Wilson said. "Save your strength. You've done enough." They moved out into the storm. The rain had lessened slightly, but the wind still howled through the trees. Flashlight beams bounced off wet leaves and tree trunks, creating a disorienting strobe effect. Anthony tried to keep track of their progress, but exhaustion and whatever medication they'd given him made everything blur together. He caught glimpses of his grandfather's stretcher ahead of him, carried carefully by 4 people. The terrain grew steeper. Anthony recognized the ravine he'd fallen down earlier. Had it really been only hours ago? The team picked their way down more carefully, using ropes and harnesses to manage the stretchers. Almost there, he heard someone say, "Clearing's just ahead." Then they were in the open space beneath the ruined tower. Anthony stared up at the metal skeleton, swaying slightly in the wind. Had it always looked so fragile? Martinez was on his radio again, directing the helicopter in. The wind picked up, whipping rain into stinging sheets. A sound cut through the storm. Helicopter blades, growing louder. "Clear the LZ," someone shouted. "Secure loose equipment." The darkness above them filled with noise and wind as the helicopter appeared, its searchlight cutting through the rain. The downdraft from its rotors bent the surrounding trees, sending branches and debris flying. Anthony watched as they loaded his grandfather into the helicopter first, the medical team climbing in with him. Then it was his turn. Hands lifted his stretcher, passing him up to the crew inside. "Good luck, kid," he heard Peters shout over the noise. "We'll check on you at the hospital." The helicopter lifted off, rising above the tower and trees. Anthony pressed his face against the small window, watching the forest fall away below them. Somewhere down there, 4 flashlight beams marked where the Rangers stood in the clearing, growing smaller and smaller until they vanished in the darkness. His grandfather lay next to him, still unconscious, but surrounded by medical equipment and watchful paramedics. Anthony reached out and caught his hand, cold but still there. Still fighting. "I did it, Grandpa," he whispered, even though he knew his grandfather couldn't hear him over the helicopter's noise. "I found help, just like you taught me." The helicopter banked, turning toward the distant lights of Portland. Anthony kept his eyes on the forest below until it disappeared into the storm-dark night, still gripping his grandfather's hand like it was a lifeline. He had done the impossible. He had found his way through the darkness. He had saved his grandfather. But as the adrenaline finally faded and the full weight of everything that had happened crashed down on him, Anthony Thompson began to shake. Not from cold this time, but from the delayed reaction to hours of fear and desperation and near disaster. A paramedic noticed and draped another blanket over him, saying something reassuring that was lost in the helicopter noise. Anthony barely noticed. His whole world had narrowed to the feel of his grandfather's hand in his and the steady beep of the heart monitor that meant they still had a chance. The storm raged on below them as the helicopter carried them toward help. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Anthony allowed himself to hope that everything might actually be okay. The helicopter's cabin filled with urgent voices as they approached Portland. Anthony tried to focus on what the paramedics were saying, but the words seemed to blur together. His grandfather's hand had grown colder in his grip. BP dropping again, someone called out. "Push another round of..." The rest was lost in a sudden burst of turbulence. The helicopter bucked, making the medical equipment rattle. Anthony tightened his hold on his grandfather's hand. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. 5 minutes to hospital." The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Weather's rough. Hang on." Anthony looked out the window. The city lights below appeared and disappeared through gaps in the clouds, distorted by sheets of rain. Each flash of lightning made his heart jump, remembering how alone he'd felt in the forest. A sharp beeping cut through his thoughts. One of the monitors attached to his grandfather was flashing red. "No pulse," a paramedic shouted. "Starting compressions." They pulled Anthony's hand away from his grandfather's. He tried to resist, but his muscles were too weak to put up much fight. Someone pushed his stretcher back to make room. "Grandpa." The word came out as a croak. "Please no." "Stay back, kid," one of the paramedics ordered. "Let us work." Anthony could only watch as they performed CPR. The helicopter cabin seemed to shrink around him, filled with the sound of counting compressions and medical terms he didn't understand. "Clear," someone shouted. Anthony saw his grandfather's body jerk as they used the defibrillator. Nothing. Again. Clear. Another jolt. The monitor continued its angry beeping. "Come on, Grandpa," Anthony whispered. "Please. Don't leave me." The city lights grew closer below them. Anthony could make out streets now, cars moving like toys through the rain. "Hospital, 2 minutes," the pilot announced. "They're ready for us?" One more time, the lead paramedic said. "Clear." This time, after the shock, the monitor's tone changed. A steady beeping replaced the alarm. "We've got rhythm." Someone pressed fingers against his grandfather's neck. Pulse weak, but present. Anthony slumped back on his stretcher, tears mixing with the rain still drying on his face. His grandfather was still alive, still fighting. The helicopter descended toward a lit helipad on top of a building. Medical personnel in rain gear waited below, hunched against the wind. The landing was rough. As soon as the skids touched down, the rear doors burst open. Hands reached in, pulling out his grandfather's stretcher first. "Male, 72, cardiac episode in the field," one of the paramedics rattled off as they rushed the stretcher inside. "Multiple resuscitations required." Their voices faded as they disappeared through a door. Then it was Anthony's turn. The hospital staff transferred him to a new stretcher, wheeling him quickly out of the rain. "Second patient, 13-year-old male," someone was saying. "Mild hypothermia, exposure, exhaustion." The bright hospital lights hurt his eyes after so long in the darkness. Everything seemed too loud, too sharp, too real. People in scrubs and white coats moved around him, checking vital signs, asking questions he could barely process. "Can you tell me your name?" A doctor leaned over him, shining a light in his eyes. "Anthony Thompson," he mumbled. "Where's my grandpa?" "He's getting the best care possible," the doctor said. "Right now we need to focus on you." "Any pain? Dizziness?" Anthony tried to answer, but his tongue felt too big for his mouth. The lights overhead blurred into streaks as they wheeled him down a hallway. "Temperature's still low," someone said. "Get warming blankets in here." They moved him to a hospital bed. The sheets felt rough against his skin after so long in wet clothes. Someone started cutting away what remained of his t-shirt and jeans. "Anthony?" A familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Oh my God, Anthony!" His grandmother pushed through the medical team, her face wet with tears. She grabbed his hand, the same one that had held his grandfather's in the helicopter. "Grandma?" His voice cracked. "Grandpa-y?" "I know, baby." She stroked his hair back from his forehead. "They're taking care of him. You just rest now." "I tried to help," he said, the words starting to slur together. "I tried to find—" "You did help." She kissed his forehead. "You saved his life. The Rangers told me everything." The medical team worked around them, attaching monitors, hanging for bags, piling warm blankets on top of him. Anthony barely noticed. Now that his grandmother was here, the last of his strength seemed to drain away. "Don't leave," he whispered, tightening his grip on her hand. "I'm right here." She pulled a chair close to the bed. "I'm not going anywhere." Time became fluid after that. Anthony drifted in and out of consciousness, never quite sure if he was awake or dreaming. Sometimes he thought he was back in the forest, running through endless trees. Other times he heard voices, doctors and nurses, his grandmother talking softly on the phone, someone crying in the hallway. "Remarkable kid," he heard someone say during one of his more lucid moments. 4 hours in that storm, and he never gave up. "Surgery going well," another voice said later. "Next few hours will be critical. Should have seen the Rangers' faces when they told me," his grandmother was saying to someone. Said they've never seen anything like it. Each time he surfaced, Anthony tried to ask about his grandfather, but the words never seemed to come out right, and the darkness always pulled him back under before he got an answer. The next time he fully woke, sunlight was streaming through a window. His grandmother dozed in the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. The storm had passed. "Grandma?" His voice was stronger now, though his throat felt raw. She jerked awake. "Anthony? How are you feeling, baby?" "Grandpa?" He had to know. "Is he?" A smile broke across her tired face. "He's okay. The surgery went well. He's in recovery now." Anthony closed his eyes, relief washing over him in waves. "Can I see him?" "Soon." She squeezed his hand. "You both need rest first. You've been through so much." As if to prove her point, exhaustion started dragging at him again. But this time it was different. Not the bone-deep fatigue of survival, but the natural tiredness of healing. "The Rangers want to talk to you when you're feeling better," his grandmother said softly. "They said what you did out there. It was incredible." Anthony shook his head slightly. "I just remembered what Grandpa taught me. About the forest, about not giving up. You did more than that." She wiped tears from her eyes. "You showed more courage than most grown men would have. I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud." A nurse came in to check his vital signs. "Looking much better," she said cheerfully. "Temperature's almost normal." "How's the pain?" Anthony hadn't even noticed the aches until she mentioned them. His whole body felt like one giant bruise, and his muscles protested even the smallest movement. "I'm okay," he said, not wanting anything that might make him sleep again. "When can I see my grandpa?" The nurse and his grandmother exchanged looks. "Let's see how you're doing in a few hours," the nurse said. "Both of you need time to recover." But Anthony was already forming a plan. As soon as he could walk, he was going to find his grandfather's room. No storm, no forest, no hospital staff was going to keep them apart. His grandmother seemed to read his mind. "Don't even think about it," she said, but her voice held a hint of amusement. "You're staying right here until the doctors say otherwise." "Yes, ma'am," Anthony said, trying to look innocent. But they both knew that the same determination that had kept him going through the storm was still there, just waiting for a chance. Outside his window, the city was waking up to a clear morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles and broken branches as the only evidence of its fury. Somewhere in this same building, his grandfather was recovering, alive because his grandson had refused to give up. Anthony Thompson closed his eyes, still holding his grandmother's hand. For now, he would rest. But soon, very soon, he would see his grandfather again. And this time, nothing would stand in his way. The morning sun warmed his face through the window, chasing away the last memories of cold rain and darkness. In its light, the terror of the previous night began to fade, leaving behind something stronger, the knowledge that when it really mattered, he had found courage he never knew he had. Anthony watched the clock on the hospital wall tick past noon. He'd been awake for hours now, picking at bland hospital food and answering endless questions from doctors and nurses. His body still ached, but the bone-deep exhaustion had faded to a manageable tiredness. Just a few more tests, the latest nurse promised as she drew blood from his arm. "You're recovering remarkably well. When can I see my grandpa?" It was the same question he'd been asking everyone who entered his room. "Soon," she said, just like all the others. "He needs rest, and so do you." Anthony slumped back against his pillows. His grandmother had gone to check on his grandfather, promising to return with news. That had been over an hour ago. A knock on the door made him look up. Two people in ranger uniforms entered, Martinez and the female ranger from the forest. They looked different in the daylight, less intimidating without rain gear and flashlights. "How are you feeling, kid?" Martinez asked, pulling up a chair. "I'm fine." Anthony sat up straighter. "How's my grandpa?" The rangers exchanged looks. "He's stable," the woman, her name tag Red Collins, said. "The doctors are optimistic." Martinez leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We need to talk about what happened out there. Think you're up for that?" Anthony nodded. He'd been expecting this. "Start from the beginning," Collins said gently. "Take your time." So Anthony told them everything. The walk with his grandfather, the collapse, the desperate search for help. The words came easier now, in the safety of the hospital room, though his hands still shook when he described finding the abandoned cabin and the stranger with the tarp. "We'll look into that," Martinez said, making notes. "That cabin should have been secured. The important thing," Collins added, "is that you kept your head. Most people would have panicked, but you remembered your training." "It wasn't training," Anthony said quietly. "Just stuff Grandpa taught me. About the forest, about not giving up. Those lessons saved both your lives." Martinez put his notebook away. "The medical team said another hour out there in that weather? Well, let's just say you did good, kid." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Anthony heard his grandmother's voice, raised in argument with someone. He needs to know, she was saying. You can't keep them apart. The door burst open. His grandmother strode in, followed by a harried-looking doctor. Mrs. Thompson, the doctor was saying, your husband needs rest. He needs his grandson. She cut him off. She turned to Anthony. Your grandfather's awake. He's asking for you. Anthony was already pulling back his blankets. Where is he? Now hold on, the doctor protested. Neither of you are in any condition. I'll take him, Martinez offered, standing up. Got a wheelchair, right here in the hallway. The doctor looked like he wanted to argue, but Collins stepped in. We'll make sure he's not overtired. Professional escort. 5 minutes later, Anthony found himself being wheeled down the hospital corridor, and 4-pole rolling alongside him. His grandmother walked next to him, one hand on his shoulder. The Rangers flanked them like an honor guard. They stopped outside a room in the cardiac unit. Through the window, Anthony could see monitors and medical equipment surrounding a bed. His grandfather lay there, looking smaller and older than Anthony had ever seen him. Ready? His grandmother asked softly. Anthony nodded, not trusting his voice. Martinez pushed the wheelchair into the room. The beeping of heart monitors filled the air. Steady now, regular. A vast improvement from the helicopter. His grandfather's eyes were closed, his face pale against the white hospital pillows. For a moment, Anthony thought he was asleep. Then those familiar dark eyes opened, focusing immediately on Anthony. There's my boy, Mr. Thompson said, his voice weak but clear. Something broke inside Anthony's chest. Tears spilled down his cheeks as Martinez wheeled him right up to the bed. Grandpa, he choked out. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you. Stop that. His grandfather reached out with a shaking hand, catching Anthony's fingers. You did everything right. Everything. But I got lost. I couldn't find help fast enough. You found help, Mr. Thompson interrupted. You survived. You saved both our lives. His grip tightened slightly. I've never been more proud. Anthony bent forward, pressing his forehead against their clasped hands. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs. The Rangers told me what you did, his grandfather continued softly. How far you ran. How you never gave up. That's more than survival skills, son. That's pure heart. I was so scared, Anthony whispered. When you collapsed, I didn't know what to do. But you did know. Everything I taught you, everything you learned, it was all there when you needed it. Anthony looked up at his grandfather's face. The color was returning to his cheeks, and his eyes were clear and alert. The doctor said it was a heart attack, his grandmother said from behind them. But they caught it in time. Thanks to you. Martinez cleared his throat. The rescue team wants to talk to you both when you're feeling up to it. The way you handled yourself out there, kid. Well, let's just say we could use more people like you in the service. Anthony straightened slightly. Really? Really? Collins stepped forward. In fact, we'd like to offer you something. A junior ranger program, specially designed. If you're interested, hope bloomed in Anthony's chest. He looked at his grandfather, who was smiling proudly. See? Mr. Thompson said. Sometimes the worst moments lead us right where we need to be. A nurse appeared in the doorway. 5 more minutes, she said firmly. Then both patients need rest. Anthony tightened his grip on his grandfather's hand. I'll come back. I know you will. Mr. Thompson's eyes crinkled at the corners. You never give up. You prove that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. Outside the window, the sun had broken fully through the clouds, turning the rain-washed city golden. Grandpa, Anthony said quietly, when you're better, will you teach me more about the forest? His grandfather's smile widened. Every day, son. Every single day. The nurse returned with reinforcements. Another wheelchair for Mr. Thompson. Time for tests, she announced. As they wheeled them in opposite directions, Anthony kept his eyes on his grandfather until he disappeared around a corner. But this time, the separation didn't feel like abandonment. This time, he knew exactly where to find him. Back in his room, Anthony let the nurses help him into bed. His body was tired again, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes after accomplishing something important. Martinez and Collins stood at his door. We'll be back tomorrow, Martinez said. Get some rest, kid. You've earned it. After they left, his grandmother pulled her chair close to his bed again. Sleep, she said softly. Everything's okay now. Anthony closed his eyes, but not before glancing at the window. Beyond the city skyline, he could just make out the dark line of forest on the horizon. The place that had tried to take his grandfather, but had instead given Anthony something precious, the knowledge of his own strength. This time when sleep came, he didn't dream of running through darkness. Instead, he dreamed of walking familiar trails with his grandfather, learning new lessons, growing stronger with each step. And somewhere in the hospital, a rescued forest ranger dreamed of teaching his grandson everything he knew, proud beyond words of the boy who had faced down a storm to save him. 3 days after the storm, Anthony stood in his kitchen, staring at a piece of paper covered in his grandmother's handwriting. It was a list of his grandfather's medications, names he couldn't pronounce, schedules he had to memorize. Blue pill with breakfast, he muttered, sorting through the bottles on the counter. White one at lunch, 2 yellow ones before bed. His grandmother appeared behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. You don't have to do this, you know. I can handle the medications. I want to help. Anthony carefully arranged the pill bottles in order of use. You're already doing everything else. It was true. Since they brought his grandfather home yesterday, his grandmother had barely stopped moving, cooking, cleaning, answering phone calls from concerned neighbors, coordinating with doctors. The house felt different now. Medical equipment cluttered the living room, where a hospital bed had temporarily replaced his grandfather's favorite armchair. The kitchen counter looked like a pharmacy. Every surface held reminder notes about medications and doctor appointments. He's asking for you, his grandmother said softly. Says he's bored. Anthony gathered the morning medication and a glass of water. His hands shook slightly as he carried them to the living room, remembering how still his grandfather had looked in the forest. But Mr. Thompson was sitting up in bed today, looking more like himself. The color had returned to his face, though dark circles still lingered under his eyes. There's my rescue ranger, he said, smiling at Anthony's approach. Anthony set the pills and water on the bedside table. How are you feeling? Better every minute. His grandfather patted the edge of the bed. Sit with me for a bit. Anthony perched carefully on the mattress, watching as his grandfather swallowed the medications one by one. Rangers called this morning, Mr. Thompson said between pills. They're starting your junior program next week. I don't know if I should. Anthony glanced toward the kitchen. There's so much to do here. Life goes on, son. His grandfather set the empty glass aside. We can't let fear stop us from living. Before Anthony could respond, the doorbell rang. His grandmother answered it, and moments later Martinez appeared in the living room doorway. Hope I'm not interrupting, the ranger said. Just wanted to drop these off. He held out a package wrapped in brown paper. Anthony took it, feeling something soft inside. Open it, Martinez encouraged. Anthony tore off the paper. Inside was a folded ranger uniform, smaller than standard issue, but otherwise identical to the one Martinez wore. A junior ranger badge glinted on the chest. Collins had it rushed, Martinez explained. We start training next Monday if you're still interested. Anthony ran his fingers over the badge. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately, to dive into learning everything his grandfather knew about the forest. But another part, I don't know if I can, he said quietly. Grandpa needs me here. What your grandfather needs, Mr. Thompson said firmly, is for you to live your life, to follow your dreams. But what if something happens again? What if you need help and I'm not here? That's what these are for. His grandmother appeared with a handful of small devices. Emergency alert buttons. One for every room, plus portables we can carry. The whole ranger station's on call too, Martinez added. Any problems? We're 15 minutes away. Anthony looked at his grandfather. You're sure? More than sure. Mr. Thompson reached for the uniform jacket. Try it on. Let me see my grandson in ranger green. With trembling fingers, Anthony slipped on the jacket. It fit perfectly. Look at that, his grandfather said proudly. A natural. Martinez checked his watch. I should head out. But before I go, he pulled something else from his pocket, a familiar leather notebook. We found this in the forest, he said, holding it out. Thought you might want it back. Anthony recognized his grandfather's Ranger notebook, the one that had fallen when he collapsed. The pages were water-damaged but intact. Actually, his grandfather said, "I think it's time that belonged to someone else." Anthony took the notebook with reverence. Inside, decades of forest knowledge was recorded in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Notes about trails, wildlife behavior, weather patterns, survival tips. "Every ranger needs a good notebook," Martinez said. "Something to pass on to the next generation." A lump formed in Anthony's throat. He opened his mouth to thank them, but no words came out. "I'll see you Monday," Martinez said, understanding in his eyes. 9 a.m. sharp. After the ranger left, Anthony sat with his grandfather, carefully turning the fragile pages of the notebook. "I was so scared," he admitted quietly. "Not just in the forest, but yesterday when you came home. What if something goes wrong again?" "Something probably will go wrong again," his grandfather said. "That's life. But now we know how strong you are. How capable." "I don't feel strong." "No." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "The boy who ran through a storm for hours, who never gave up, who saved my life. That boy isn't strong." Anthony shrugged, embarrassed. "I just did what I had to do." "Exactly." His grandfather squeezed his arm. "That's what strength is. Doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Anthony reading the notebook while his grandfather dozed. Outside, the neighborhood was coming to life. Kids riding bikes, parents heading to work, dogs barking at squirrels. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Anthony's teachers bringing schoolwork he'd missed and a card signed by his whole class. "Take your time coming back," his math teacher said. "But keep up with the work if you can." Anthony nodded, thinking of all the times he'd zoned out in class, dreaming of the forest. Now he had a chance to combine both worlds, to learn about what he loved while keeping up with his regular studies. Later that afternoon, his grandmother sent him to the grocery store with a long list. It felt strange, doing something so normal after everything that had happened. The store clerk, who'd known Anthony since he was small, rang up his items with careful attention. "Your grandfather's a tough old bird," she said as she bagged the groceries. "And you're made of the same stuff." Walking home, Anthony thought about how different everything looked now. The same streets, the same houses, but he wasn't the same person who'd walked them a week ago. He'd faced death in that forest. He'd run until his body gave out, fought through fear and exhaustion and despair. And he'd won. Back home, he helped his grandmother put away the groceries, then checked his grandfather's medication schedule again. "Time for the afternoon pills." "You're good at this," his grandmother said, watching him measure doses. "Taking care of people? I learned from the best." Anthony smiled at her. "Both of you." That evening, as sunset painted the sky orange, Anthony sat on the front porch steps wearing his new Ranger jacket. The notebook lay open in his lap as he made his first entry. Day 1 as Junior Ranger, grandfather's medication schedule. He listed the pills and times carefully, just as his grandfather had taught him to record important details. A mockingbird landed on the porch railing, tilting its head at him. Anthony added, "Local wildlife observations," just like he'd seen in his grandfather's entries. From inside came the sounds of his grandmother cooking dinner, the TV playing softly in his grandfather's room, the normal rhythm of their life slowly returning. But things would never be exactly the same. They were all changing, growing, adapting, and maybe that was okay. Anthony touched the badge on his chest, feeling its weight. The weight of responsibility, of growing up, of becoming someone new while holding on to who he'd always been. The mockingbird flew away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the distance, the forest waited, no longer just a place of childhood adventures, but a teacher, a challenge, a proving ground. He was ready. 2 months after the storm, Anthony stood at the edge of the forest trail, his new Ranger notebook clutched in one hand. His grandfather stood beside him, leaning slightly on a walking stick, but otherwise steady on his feet. "You sure about this?" Anthony asked, studying his grandfather's face for any sign of fatigue. "Doctor cleared me last week." Mr. Thompson adjusted the emergency alert device hanging around his neck. "Just a short walk, to get our feet wet." Behind them, Ranger Martinez leaned against his truck. "I'll be right here if you need anything." Anthony nodded, touching the radio clipped to his junior ranger belt. They weren't taking any chances this time. "Ready?" his grandfather asked. Anthony took a deep breath. This was the first time either of them had been back to the forest since that night. The path ahead looked different in the morning sunlight, less threatening, but still holding memories of fear and desperation. They started walking slowly, Mr. Thompson setting a careful pace. Anthony stayed close to his grandfather's side, watching for any sign of trouble. "You're hovering," his grandfather said after a few minutes. "No, I'm not." Anthony forced himself to take a step back. "Just being careful." Mr. Thompson's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Like your grandmother's been just being careful for the past 2 months?" It was true. The whole family had become protective, scheduling medication alarms, coordinating doctor visits, always having someone nearby. Anthony knew it sometimes frustrated his grandfather, this constant monitoring. They reached a fallen log, not the log from that night, but similar enough to make Anthony's stomach tighten. "Let's rest a minute," Mr. Thompson said, lowering himself carefully onto the trunk. Anthony hovered nearby, one hand ready to help if needed. But his grandfather settled without difficulty, patting the space beside him. "Sit," he ordered, "and open that notebook. Time for a lesson." Anthony sat, flipping to a fresh page. These past 2 months, he'd filled dozens of pages with notes from his junior ranger training, wildlife patterns, plant identification, emergency protocols. "What do you hear?" his grandfather asked. Anthony closed his eyes, listening. Wind in the trees, birds calling, a distant woodpecker, western tanager, he said, pointing east, downy woodpecker to the north. And he concentrated. Running water? Must be the creek rising from all the spring rain. Good. Pride filled his grandfather's voice. "Now, what do you feel?" Wind from the southwest. Temperature around 60 degrees. Humidity's high. Probably rain later. "Excellent. Open your eyes." Anthony did. The forest looked different now. Not just trees and shadows, but a living ecosystem he was learning to read like a book. "You've learned more in 2 months than most trainees learn in a year," his grandfather said. "Martinez says you're his best student." "I had a good teacher." Anthony smiled at him. "Still do." They sat quietly for a moment, listening to the forest sounds. A squirrel scolded them from a nearby branch, making them both chuckle. "I need to show you something," Mr. Thompson said finally. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Anthony recognized his grandfather's medical chart. "What's wrong?" "Did the doctor say?" "Nothing's wrong." His grandfather unfolded the paper. "Look at the progress notes." Anthony scanned the document. Words jumped out at him. "Remarkable recovery and exceeding expectations and cleared for light activity." "The doctors say it's unusual," Mr. Thompson continued. "Most heart attack patients my age take much longer to recover." "You know why I'm doing so well?" Anthony shook his head. "Because of you." His grandfather's voice grew serious. "Not just because you saved my life that night, but because every day since, you've given me a reason to get stronger." "Grandpa, let me finish." Mr. Thompson folded the paper carefully. "Watching you these past months, learning, growing, facing your fears, it's been the best medicine I could ask for." Tears pricked at Anthony's eyes. He blinked them away, focusing on writing in his notebook so his grandfather wouldn't see. "I've been thinking," Mr. Thompson said. "Maybe it's time to make some changes. Pass on more responsibilities." Anthony looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Junior Ranger program is just the start. There's so much more I can teach you. If you're willing to learn." "Of course I am." "It won't be easy." His grandfather's eyes were serious. "There's a lot to learn. A lot of responsibility. I can handle it." Anthony sat up straighter. "I want to learn everything." Mr. Thompson smiled. "I know you can handle it. You've proved that already." A drop of rain hit Anthony's notebook, smearing the ink slightly. More drops followed. "We should head back," Anthony said, already standing to help his grandfather. "In a minute." Mr. Thompson tilted his face up to the rain. "Remember what I taught you about spring storms? They're usually gentle," Anthony recited. "Unlike the winter ones. More rain than wind." "Good. What else?" They help the forest grow. New leaves, new life. Exactly. His grandfather stood, using his walking stick for balance. Sometimes the hard times help us grow too. They walked back toward the trailhead, moving slowly but steadily through the light rain. Anthony kept one eye on his grandfather and one on their surroundings, just as his training had taught him. Martinez was still waiting by his truck, radio in hand. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," Mr. Thompson said. "Just perfect." On the drive home, Anthony looked through his notebook, adding details about the morning's observations. His grandfather dozed in the passenger seat, looking peaceful. Back at the house, Anthony's grandmother waited on the porch, trying not to look worried. "How was it?" she asked as they walked up. "Good," Anthony said, helping his grandfather up the steps. "Really good." Inside, he went through the familiar routine, checking vital signs, organizing medications, updating the medical log. But something felt different now. Lighter. That evening, Anthony sat at the kitchen table, homework spread out in front of him. Through the window, he could see his grandfather in the backyard, pointing out something to Martinez, who had stayed for dinner. His grandmother brought him a glass of milk and kissed the top of his head. "You know," she said softly, "I used to worry about you following in your grandfather's footsteps. The forest can be dangerous, but now I see it wasn't just about the forest. It was about finding your path, your strength." Anthony thought about that as he worked on his math problems on his desk. The Junior Ranger notebook sat next to his school books, two parts of his life fitting together at last. Later, as the sun set, his grandfather called him outside. They stood in the backyard, watching the clouds turn pink and orange. "I want to show you something else," Mr. Thompson said. He pulled out his old Ranger badge, the real one, not a junior version. "This was my life for 30 years, he said, turning the badge in his hands. "Protecting the forest, helping people, passing on knowledge." He held out the badge to Anthony. "Grandpa, I can't." "Not yet," his grandfather said. "But someday, when you're ready." Anthony took the badge carefully, feeling its weight. "Until then," Mr. Thompson continued, "we've got work to do, lessons to learn, a forest to protect." "Together," Anthony said. "Together." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the forest waited, not as a place of fear anymore, but as a teacher, a challenge, a future. Anthony Thompson, Junior Ranger, son of the forest, touched the badge in his pocket and smiled. He was ready for whatever lessons came next.